Maybe going live, maybe not going live.
Li- Being live
It
streamed.
see the thing is, in on Zoom it says we are live. On one of the pages, it doesn't show us live. Now, there it is.
I think
Okay.
it's
And
every
in the
week.
third place where I always expect it to be, there's still nothing. It's like it's doing nothing. So I don't know.
It's so funny because every week we go, it's not doing it yet. I don't think it's doing it. Then I hear your voice in the background is.
It's like, yep, we were live the whole time, but I don't know how I know that. Because the one time that I'm going to be like, okay, as soon as it shows up on Zoom and it says that we're live, I'm going to trust it. Then it's not going to be live and I'll have to redo my whole intro.
That's very true. Well, it'll be a thing.
And apparently, I have a deeper aversion to that than having the first 5 minutes of the podcast be, I don't know, maybe we're live. Are we live? Maybe we're live.
It's part of our charm, Aaron. If you wanted a very highly polished podcast, what are you
This
looking
isn't
here
it.
for? We are being true educators in this moment.
Yes, hi, welcome to the Folk Music Educator podcast.
Like, as we're sitting here, I'm thinking Messy Desk would have also been a great name for a podcast for us. The
Oh my
messy,
goodness, it's
the messy.
so true. My
It could
desk
have been
has
the
been
best.
clean like once a year, usually. My desk is cleaned.
Once a
It's
year,
usually the day I'm leaving for like
uh,
6 weeks. That's the day my desk is clean.
my
One
dad
day.
always used to make the joke that because my dad was a music teacher in the public schools, that he needed summer break to clean up and then prepare for the next year. He goes, "It takes a long time."
Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And even when I'm like, okay, I've got everything really cleaned up, and it's like, oh, I found another project.
Do
I
you?
really think a clean desk is a sign that there's nothing to do. And I don't think that I'm actually a person who wants nothing to do, as it turns out.
Yeah, there's a part of me that's like retirement. I don't know if I want that. I'm like that. Like, of course, my knees are still 32-year-old knees. I don't. Well, 31. I don't know how they will be feeling about retirement when they're 62-year-old knees. But that's neither here nor there
Is
yet.
it our knees that get to decide you're done? Maybe it
I
is.
feel as a
Maybe it's not
rot.
our brains, it's just our knees.
Yeah, as a rotund American, yeah, the knees are the the knees are the bottleneck of Thermopylae at the moment.
So funny.
But by the way, audience, hello. Welcome to the Folk Music Educator podcast. We just kind of started.
Yep, we did. So I was telling you when we said, okay, we're really going to do this, we're going to go live today, that this morning, so I'm in the middle of this residency for second graders.
Hmm.
And this is the third week. And the first week we learned to play some melodies by rote. And last week we added harmony. So we played some chords and we learned
Aww.
about changing chords. So this week I introduced written music to them. And I introduced them to written music for one of the songs that I taught them by rote in the first week. And it was written down differently than I taught it to them.
Oh no.
So
Oh
we got to
no.
talk about when you get to when you want to focus on like playing it accurately the way it's written, there's a time and a place for the goal of the way you're playing is to play what's on the page. And then
Mm.
there are times when what's on the page is a tool to help you remember what you learned, but it won't be written exactly the same way you learned it by ear or by rote. And there are times when you realize that what's on the page is one of the ways you can play it right. And there are also other ways to play it right. And so you could strum more or you could strum less, and it would still be the same song. And we got to start with the idea of improvisation. And it was really sweet because one of the classes finished just a little bit early. You never know exactly how long it's going to take for like the last lineup. Some weeks it takes a long time, as it turns out, with second graders. But this, they were quick, and then the classroom music teacher has been teaching them this little song that has a space for a phrase that you get to make your own, and it's like something happens in the garden. So like you're singing about being in the garden, and then there's a phrase you can add, and then you're singing about being in the garden. And I watched as every single kid in that class made up their own phrase and sang it as a solo, their little part of it. And I was like, they got to do rhythmic improvisation. They got to do lyrical improvisation. We got to do all these little forms of improvisation as second graders. Ah,
That's
those
so
kids are
cute.
gonna rule the world.
That's so cute. I love that.
Yeah, it was really fun.
I love having those conversations as an adult with like as an adult teacher. I get a
Yeah,
lot of folks that show up with a different lexicon of experience with me, like
right.
music. And so there's a couple of people who show up really concerned. They're like, I don't really know how to read music. Is that going to be a problem? Like, no, not even a little bit. And then some folks who come in, they're just like, oh, yeah, I've been learning a lot of tabs and sheet music off Amanda lessons and stuff like that. So I'm feeling good. I'm like, when was the last time you learned a tune by ear? Never. Never. I'm like, ah ha ha, we're going to be doing some things. And that is always a big hurdle for a lot of students is they grew up playing in band or taking piano lessons
Yeah.
or something and really looking at the sheet music as sacred, as biblical, as something you do
Mhm.
not change, and that is the word of law. And it's been very interesting to have to kind of let people know that like the man apparently I'm very popular today and I can't get the buzzing to stop. Anyway, um there's the it's been very interesting to kind of like let them know that these are closer to being like sound recipes versus like actually like a thing to do because I'm like think about
Yeah, and the
biscuits.
recipe is for like barbecuing. The recipe is not for like baking pastries.
Exactly, yeah, I was like in this case like this is like oh biscuits and gravy is essentially you know you have a biscuit, you have meat and fat plus milk and flour and that's basically it, but there are thousands of different ways of doing it. My mom's the best, but that's and that's kind of how a lot of folk music is like you look at this music for Soldier's Joy and it's just enough to let you know how the tune is supposed to go. It is really
Mhm.
up to your own proclivities to kind of figure out where the bowing patterns, where the chords, the double stops, all that stuff kind of happens. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that, oh, I can see the sheet music now and go, oh, this is much closer to the Missouri version of Soldier's Joy or the Northeastern or the Irish or all these things. There's definitely a lot of ways to make a biscuit. And I don't know. I think that's a big once people get past that hurdle and just like, okay, I'm going and playing, this is basically showing me a fiddle tune shaped object in my mind, not a, not scripture that I have to perform exact.
Yeah, and I think for me and for a lot of people, like the first hurdle is to sort of break down the idea that there's like a really concrete right way to do things. There's a
Mm-hmm.
right way to play. Just recently in one of the sort of dulcimer forum groups on Facebook, there was a thread about some, there's like I'm interested in learning where should I start kind of things pop up pretty regularly. And there's as many different places to start as there are people in the group. So
Yeah.
it's like, oh, I started with this book and it was really great. I started with this video and it was really great. You should start by playing chords. You should start by playing note or drone style. You should start in DAA. You should start in DAD. You should start just picking out tunes you already know by ear. You should start. And you know, it can be really overwhelming as a person who's like, I just like give me one step to do, you know? Like, how do you learn to knit? You like learn how to make the slip knot at the beginning. Like that's the first thing you do, right? And also, it's very representative of how many different right ways there are to approach folk music. And
Mm-hmm.
it's really hard for those of us who grew up, I think, probably in like a, a more kind of conservative culture or like a
Tradi-
more faith-based centric place. Like there is right, there is truth with a capital T, you know, there and there is only one way and one truth, and your whole life's work is to find what it is. You know, that's
yeah.
kind of the framework that I feel like I started a lot of my life with, and now it's like, look at how many different right ways there are. There's so many right ways to play Soldier's Joy. And the question of like, am I doing it right? Comes more down to, do you like the way it sounds?
Mm-hmm.
And where do you want to do it? So if you want to play Soldier's Joy at a bluegrass jam, you're going to need to know both the chords and the melody. You
Mm-hmm.
can't just know the melody. And you don't even have to know the melody really well. You can improvise more of the melody, but you got to know where you're going with the chords. If you want to play Soldier's Joy at an Irish session, you got to have a sense of where those embellishments are going to go. If you want to play it at an old time session, you got to have the right kind of rhythmic groove to it. You know, there are some things in order to participate in the group social learning aspect that can be really valuable to say, okay, in this context, this is some important things you're going to need to be able to do in order to participate in that kind of social setting. But are you doing it wrong if you're not following all of those exact patterns? The answer is no. Like, there's another folk music community somewhere else who's probably doing it exactly the way you're doing it. Or maybe you're going to be the innovator who's creating a new path. And all of that is right.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's I I love that notation is really starting to have this kind of discourse because like one of the soapboxes that I will kind of die on this hill is that as helpful as notation is for certain things, it is a technology that was kind of built for um, be- the ease of use of classical music, essentially. Like it was very much like, hey, all of the tools that were built on there were built with a certain level of expectation of almost aristocratic kind of things. There have been
Yeah.
updates, but that's always been kind of where it goes. And that, so when you do get into a folk music tradition, there's literally like holes of it, like in the notation system that for like techniques that aren't really used in the classical system that haven't needed a
Mhm.
notation system for it yet that aren't present, and so that leads us to a lot of us to have to invent our own and all these things. Like I don't know if
Yeah,
you
and a lot of us are looking around in the pieces of software that do the digital notation now and going, okay, this particular software has these kinds of tools available. And so, within the constraints of the way this particular software manages all of this, how am I gonna notate the thing? And there's
it
not really clear systems for a lot of the things we're trying to
oh
communicate
yeah,
about.
like if we were to take a true transcription of like an old time fiddle players like bowing patterns and all those things and try to put it on note for note into it's a mess. It is wild. It is not easy to read. It is a reference material at that point be for its complexity and not for like you start to if you're making an exact cop like are you like okay is this supposed to be a ghost note because like or is that a full thing? Like, how do you notate a note that is in between, that's a little bit flat? And you're like, am I respecting that as a art form, or am I taking that as a, um, oh, they're just making a mistake, and I'm bringing it close to, actually, to F sharp instead of that in
Right.
between?
Yep. Yep.
And it's one of those things of like, it's both, it's neither. Everything's made up and the points don't matter.
Right. The person who's writing it down is deciding if the person who's playing it is doing it right.
Yeah, exactly. And so for
Uh-huh.
me, I've realized that, like, especially when it comes to fretted instruments, tablature that shows the rhythmic part of tablature
Yeah.
ends up much better mapping um the everything for than compared to sheet music.
Right. It's actually more precise than using notation because
Shows you where
notation
you.
is designed for instruments for which there is only one place on the instrument to play that sound. So if you think about a piano and you think about middle C, you can only play that note on one key. But
Yeah,
if you think about a guitar, there's three different strings where you can play a middle C, that exact pitch. And then you think about, like, okay, and also, are we reading it in the octave it's written, or are we reading it in the octave that makes most sense on our instrument? At which point, there's a lot of C's we can choose from to get this pitch, which on the piano, that dot on the page is a very concrete piece of directions.
exactly. And like with violin and everything, you can notate what position you're in on the staff, and you can say, oh, this is all in the G string, and so on and so forth. But it's so it is really complicated compared to, oh, this is just a fret here
Mhm.
and that exists and all that kind
Right.
of stuff. And so for me, I've actually been very tempted. I would, if I ever got a chance to teach like a course at a music college or anything like that, I would love teaching a overview on music notation systems. Not necessarily like, oh, this is them, but like exploring the logic behind them and how to, what skills you need, what preconceived ideas of context and everything going there, starting at one. Because for me, this is uh, a hot take that I've had discussions with some of my music theory friends. I think chord and lyric sheets are a form of notation. It's,
Oh.
yeah, like
Mhm.
it's just very reliant on the learner knowing how the melody goes,
Yeah.
and but it's showing like, and I think there's always a little bit of notation there. Like there's a expectation of, there's a like, whoever, whatever music notation system you're writing, the writer has to trust that the reader has a certain level of understanding of the context behind it.
Right.
And
One of the challenges that I have encountered um, is being handed tablature for an instrument that isn't mine. So like when I was yeah, when I was at South Plains College, I was taking music lessons from all the different instrument teachers. And banjo in particular seems very tablature reliant
Mhm.
more than, I mean, fiddle and violin tend to use standard notation, not a tablature system usually. And guitar and mandolin kind of cross over and do both regularly. But banjo was like, I would be taking lessons from the banjo teacher who's trying to help me learn tunes and techniques and then figure out how to apply them, and they would hand me banjo tablature. And I would be like, this is way beyond a foreign language. This is meaningless to me because this is in it's speaking like such a specific dialect kind of that it's like unless you have spent your entire life working on this instrument, it is meaningless to everyone else. And so there is this part of me that's like, wow, yeah, tablature is like this great, very specific way of communicating. And it isn't a very useful universal language of communication about music, where things like even like ABC notation or
Oh,
solfege, like the do re mi system, it creates a more universal entry point, and then all of you can sort of translate it out to your specific instrument. So I see so much value in all these different things. And like as you were talking about tablature, I thought, if that banjo tab had been written where it was like on each string, you put the letter of the pit of the note that you were playing. So instead of having like one, two, three, and four, you had like G, G sharp, A, and
uh-huh.
B flat. I could have used that to understand exactly what was going on if there were just letters on the tab instead of numbers on the tab. But like the numbers on the tab were too hard for my brain to figure out, like, what is the name of that string? And then if I count up four half
Uh-huh.
steps, that's now, it was too many layers of translation for me to get any meaning out of it.
Dennis Kaplinger, I remember my him telling my dad, and then my dad telling me that the gold standard for like banjo education books are ones that have the standard notation and tab notation explaining the exact same
Uh-huh.
recipe at the same
Uh-huh.
time, so you can see it, because honestly that would have probably been that would have alleviated that problem immediately. You could
Yeah.
have seen
Right.
not only the notes that are on the page that you're supposed to be indicating, but also what is the banjo player doing to accomplish them, because like, dear
Yeah. How are
audience,
they
I don't,
splitting them between different strings?
yeah, for anyone who doesn't know the basic logic system behind this, like sheet music does not show the placement of the notes on your instrument at all. It is just showing kind of linearly. The lowest sounding sound is on the bottom, the highest sounding sound is on the top. Tabs will actually show you where like where to place your hands on each individual string, and it's
Hmm.
usually the um, top line is your furthest away like is the furthest string away from you, and then coming up is the closest
Uh-huh.
string from you.
Uh-huh.
And banjo has that drone that's on that fifth string. And so when you're
Right.
looking at tab, it shows you like, oh, this is where I place it, and it's great. It's on that lowest sounding thing. But on standard notation, that note is like at the top. It all messes it up. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so it doesn't reveal the patterns nearly as much. And it's fascinating. And when I first started teaching online, doing all these things, I was good at one of my little jobs I had in college. One of my side hustles is that if there was a lot of band teachers and a lot of students and everything, they're like, I have a very specific thing that I want to do. I just don't want to type it out in Finale, and so they would hire me. Band
Hmm.
teachers would go, "Hey, I don't have a band. My piano player lost this part. Can I send you a PDF of this and you can type it out for me?" And I would type it out for them, and I would just make a carbon copy. It was super illegal. That's why it was fun. And I would do that all the time.
Uh-huh.
And but I could not, it was very hard for me to write out like I had never done tabs, I had never done all these things. I couldn't really think in the moment. I could recreate, but I couldn't understand the context of making something my own. And
Hmm.
it was not until I started teaching and I had to do a lot of it that I started to realize
Yeah.
like, oh, it's the lot, like understanding the context and the needs that is the most useful for me, that I started to create like a logic system behind it, and it
Yeah.
became
Yeah.
helpful. and that made my skill sets as a teacher get a lot better. And
Yeah, and you know, with the mountain dulcimer, there are dozens of tunings that are commonly used. It's a diatonic instrument in its traditional form. So if you want to play in a different key or you want to play minor versus major, it involves a different tuning. So there's all these different tunings. The idea that you would be able to base all of your playing off of standard notation is pretty tricky when every time you tune your strings a different way, the place where that note is has changed. So tab just makes so much sense. I mean, it is a much more effective way of indicating how to play a song on this particular instrument.
mhm.
But again, it doesn't do the universal, it does the specific super well. And so I think that in some ways the like standard music notation, which is the it is the standard, the gold standard of how we communicate. It's more of the like global universal communication language. And when it's treated as the best specific language too, it's like, well, that's not always true. It's probably the clearest universal system that we have. And it's
Yeah.
not the best for specifically. And you know, in the like brass and woodwinds, you've got these instruments that like they read standard notation, but it has to be transposed for their instrument or else it comes out all wonky, right? So you have this
Uh-huh.
system of like this is a B flat instrument, and so you have to have standard notation because that's all they read. But if you give them a piano player's standard notation, then they will not be playing the same thing. And
Eh,
honestly, that's more confusing than tablature to me. It's like, wait a minute, you're telling me that they have a middle C and it looks like my middle C, but they're not playing middle C? And tell me that is somehow superior or less confusing than our systems we've developed for stringed instruments. Like, I don't buy it. I buy that it's the system that they use and that maybe it can be really helpful if you're inside of that system, in the same way that if you're a mountain dulcimer player, tablature is really helpful for you inside the system. But it is not really helpful as a universal system.
it's and it's kind of like at this point it's like, to me I feel that it is the most this is the best evidence that learning by ear is the best universal system.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
takes it takes a lot more comfort. It takes a lot more discomfort at first to learn it, and it takes a
Yeah.
lot of these things. But
Mhm.
like I I'm the first to see how much it can transform somebody's life when they are able to finally just like, I'm gonna sit down and pull up a video, like even
Yeah.
an audio on Spotify of a Irish tune, and be able to learn it off the record and then go to a session and play it.
Yeah.
It really changes it. And so it's one of those, I think one of the, like, I am not going to say that, hey, people stop teaching, but I like how to reading sheet music, but I don't necessarily think it is something that is that important right off the bat. It's one of those
Right.
situations where with my students, like, um, I've had a student that has been with me for 2 years, and we have really worked on becoming fluent on a lot of different parts of musical language. So they understand scales, they understand
Yeah.
chord tones, they understand how chords kind of fit together. And so at this point, they can have a full conversation with you about their instrument, about the history of the instrument, and how all of this works. And now that we're going and introducing sheet music, they have a frame of reference in their head to explain. They now can figure out ways of explaining the phenomenon they've had in their head on paper, and it's
Yeah.
making that so much easier than trying to build two separate abstractions at the same time.
Right.
And
Right.
So for me, I think it's with kids. Like I always see these people that are trying to teach children how to read as young as like 2 or 3, and I'm just like, they can barely hold their own abstraction of talking. Don't try to do two at once. Like there's a lot of cultures that don't start teaching how to read until like 6 or 7.
Yeah. You know, my niece who's in kindergarten, she actually, so she's sat on my lap and played a dulcimer since she was 6 months old. Like this
No.
is, she's we've had some amount of like this is how you make sound on the instrument. And she was adamant that she did not want to take dulcimer lessons until she learned how to read. It was like she had this sense that once she could read words, she would also be able to learn how to read music and she would be ready for that. And
Interesting.
she was not interested in it until she hit that milestone for herself. I just thought it was so interesting. And like she's doing pretty well with it now,
Yeah.
and she really has a pretty strong sense of like what all the things on the page also mean. And she just like that is the way her mind worked, and she knew that once she could read words, she would be able to read music and she would know how to play this instrument, and she wanted to wait for that moment.
That's so funny.
Yeah, yeah. And then, there's other people who are just like, well, I don't feel like I don't I don't need that. I just want to like just show me where to put my fingers, like teach me how to play the tune and we can do it. And I don't know. I have the great joy of having several like sibling units that I get to teach, and I get to teach each of the siblings, and it's so interesting to work within this single family with the same kids who have the same kind of general experiences and see the ways that they get excited about learning.
Yeah.
And it's like every single kid in the same family will get excited about a completely different element of music learning. And one of my favorite things is to like figure out what that is and try to like really, as kids especially, but even as adults, like let's follow the dopamine, right? Let's follow the place where we're getting the energy, do that, lean into it really hard. And when we come up against a block where we can't figure out how to get past it using the tools that come most naturally to us, then we'll be ready to like grab some other tools. We're ready for a detour where we can kind of get into the music from a different
Oh yeah.
angle, but we got to go the way that's easy first. The way that looks exciting and fun and
I My favorite example of this phenomenon, and I 100% agree with everything like you're saying here, is if you ever, for dear listener, I have no idea, like me, if you have had to work a customer service slash retail slash food service kind of job. But if you've either heard a fellow coworker, someone who's training you, or if you're training someone else, you've either said or heard this phrase of, so this is how we're supposed to do it, but I don't do it this way. This is how I do it. Because that is
uh-huh.
the truth. Like our brains are problem solving, we get a job done. There is a quote unquote correct way to do something, but we are human brains all trying to just
Mhm.
cosplay our life into making the idyllic system, whatever. And for me, I think that is our greatest superpower as teachers is we're understanding like I have put it like if you haven't done this, I would encourage you to do it. Spend some time really thinking about what is the best practice for yourself. How do you accomplish these goals? Put it into writing. Be able to describe it in a 2 minute elevator pitch of how you kind of how you can understand how to teach in your relationship with sheet music or playing by ear and all that kind of stuff, and use that as your baseline for helping people, but understanding that it's also not scripture. That is a way of solving the problem, and that your job is to buy, at least for me, my experience is I spend a lot of time developing that logic in my brain, that theory of mind, or however whatever term you want to use for it, in really thinking about how I have done it, so when I encounter my students, I can help them develop their own little logic system behind it.
Right.
Magic system might be even a better way of describing it.
I
I like,
like it.
yeah,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
describing how that works. And so, if sheet music is a really super duper important part of how you do it, and you've developed systems and you understand its limitations and its strengths, and you're able to balance those things, I applaud you, and I love that you're able to do it. But also, or if you're only just doing by ear, I think that is also great because you're having to develop your own system and all that kind of stuff in the same way. But being our job is to help students kind of be on their own, like eventually, and how to be
Yeah.
active
Yeah.
members in these communities. And I think sometimes you need some nudging of just like, maybe it's time that we don't use the session to track down every tune. Maybe we could just start learning it off of recordings we get and things like that. And I don't
Hmm.
know. I hope I didn't get too preachy there, but I think this is a soapboxy thing that I've been thinking about a lot.
Yeah. Well, and I think that a big thing for me is just trying to break down some of the hierarchy of
Mm-hmm.
which form of learning is best, or which form of writing down music, or which form of like which strategy is best. Because I just, the more I know, the less I see a hierarchy of this one being superior to that one, except for individuals, right? It's like, yes, for me, I can play a tune most quickly. If you hand me some standard notation, I will be fastest at it.
Mm-hmm.
If you want me to really internalize a tune, though, you can't just give me the paper. I'm probably also going to need a lot of listening, a lot of recordings of it, and I'm gonna need to add embellishments, and I'm gonna need to like mix it. I'm gonna need to go through this whole process to really internalize a tune. Um, and I'm more likely to do that more effectively if I start with the ear and then I bring in the paper to reinforce the ear and then I go back to the ear way. So like for me, there is a like this strategy helps me do this and this strategy helps me do this and this strategy helps me do this. But as soon as I say because that's the way I learn, therefore this is the best tool, then I am putting that hierarchy back in place. And that's what I feel like I just really, in music and then in all kinds of social things around me, want to challenge myself anytime I go, well, the right way or the best way or the good way or the whatever, the superior way is the way that I experience it, then I'm missing something, and I'm really trying to consciously become aware of when I have that experience and go, wait a minute, I am seeing a hierarchy here, and that's probably not accurate. It's probably just that I have experienced it in this order, or I've experienced in this form. So,
100%. And like before, like I can hear all of my former classical violin classmates writing in now to yell at me. Like, go to if you were to look at all of the sheet music at the at um at a symphony and look at all these people are notating so many different ways, so many different fingerings, so many different
yeah,
systems
the
that make
pencil
them,
markings on the page, right, are going
yeah,
to be so different from music stand to music stand.
music stand to music stand. And then when you are playing solo stuff, the amount, like, you're constantly picking your own fingerings, your own bowings, your own things. We have
Yeah.
no, it's, there is always room for interpretation and always room
Mhm.
for a lot of individual kind of things here. And I think that was probably my biggest complaint about growing up in a kind of more classical view a lot of the time is that I there was a lot of strengths that I had that I was interested in growing. Like
Mhm.
I realized like I was really good at these bright, pretty like sounding melodies in the major keys. I loved
Mhm.
learning about the technique of things. I liked learning by ear. I liked doing all these things. And I was like, I just want to do that in this genre here. Can we balance that? No, you need to be prepared for all of these. So I'm never actually going to play any of this for you. You have to completely learn it off the page, figure all that out. And I was like, okay, so you're doing a lot of work to make me sound like a whole bunch of other people versus like to me it sounds like it as a teacher it feels like you're denying your own self the opportunity to have firsthand experience on how another musical mind works and
Mhm.
like so many of my students have taught me so many different ways that their brains work and I get to be a
Right.
little bit fluent in them and
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a better musician because of that. I feel
Yeah.
like I'm getting to read the little minds of like not little but read the minds of so many different people and how they problem solve and try to become fluent in that. And man, that's taught me way more than trying to be perfect in one person's other system.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just me. But and I'm sure it might be just you too. It might be all of us.
Yeah. No. I think this is a really important conversation. And I would talk to you all day. But I get to go help somebody learn how to use Zoom now. So
It will be great. Everyone, thank you for listening to the Folk Music Educator podcast. My name is Phil,
I'm Erin May. Thanks for hanging out, tuning in, joining us in this journey.
and we'll be back next week, hopefully. I think so.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
plan.
Okay.
See you then.
Bye.
Bye.